Hitler's right-hand man, Heinrich Himmler, had given the order that SS doctors were the only people qualified to perform the selections at Auschwitz. Hans Munch is one of the few Auschwitz doctors who was found not guilty of war crimes, but he remembers Himmler's order.
Himmler was a perfectionist, you know, and it could happen that when the selection was being performed, a layman wouldn't recognize certain features, and you'd end up gassing a few people too many, or too few. So qualified people were supposed to do it. It was their daily job. Like other doctors in normal situation would look at their patient and say, "How are you doing today?" Now you looked at the whole transport, thinking who's usable and who isn't.
Children under 12 were deemed unusable as they were too young to work. They were sent straight to the gas chambers. But when the Russians liberated Auschwitz in 1945, they were surprised to find a large group of children still alive. Many of them were twins and had their own story to tell.
Mengele was the most unique SS doctor I came into contact with. He was the only one you could really talk to. Mengele was anything but a born SS man. He just joined out of pure opportunism, and because he was very vain and the uniform was nice. Somehow he came into contact with the theory of genetic inheritance, and he saw that that was a great area to make a name for himself as a doctor. And then he heard about Auschwitz, that there were opportunities there to do genetic biological research.
Mengele was not some lone scientist pursuing his own private research. He was training under Germany's internationally respected Professor Ottmar von Verschuer.
I was not a twin, but I was like a twin. I was there with my older brother, who was less than a year older than me. When we got to Auschwitz, other Jewish prisoners came and searched between the lines for twins. They were pushing and shouting out in a number of European languages. They shouted that they were looking for twins. Someone whispered to us in Yiddish, which I understood. He said, "If you come out as twins, you will stay alive." That's how we ended up in the lab as twins. But in fact, we were not twins.
He said there had never been anything like this before, and there wouldn't be again in the near future. He should use this opportunity for doing twin research. You know, you do bad stuff to one twin and not the other, and then you cut them both open and see how things are, what's changed. Normally, you only get to do that with rabbits.
Many concentration camp doctors murdered prisoners in order to supply body parts to teaching hospitals and research laboratories all over Germany.
I don't know to this day exactly what they did, but I know that both my brother and I, well, they injected something into the base of our necks, which caused pain and swelling in my throat and a high temperature. They wanted to find out why my brother had a nice singing voice and I had a deep, hoarse voice. I don't think that by trying to find these differences and performing this operation, that they could come to any scientific conclusion. He himself rarely performed any operations. He was simply present when the experiments took place. He would take notes during the experiments. I have serious personal problems with Mengele, a very big traumatic problem, because I sometimes think if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have stayed alive.
It was one of the many deceptions which the Nazis used to medicalize the killing process. And the deception was partly for the Jews so that they could be rendered non-resisting victims as much as possible, but partly for themselves so that they could see themselves as in some way carrying out a legitimate, more or less medical procedure.
Auschwitz was not just an extermination camp. It was the clearest example of German doctors' betrayal of all their ethical training. SS doctors sentenced between 75 and 90% of the new prisoners to immediate death. The remainder were used as slave labor. New arrivals were also selected for medical experiments.
For the first time, they could implement death into their medical research. They could watch people, see how they react on certain poisons, on certain physiological and non-physiological situations, then kill the people and could see how the organs, how the brain, for instance, how liver reacted on that special research situation.
At Buchenwald, the laboratories revealed the tortured results of the doctors' research. It was the first camp where scientists had used prisoners for experiments, but it was not the only one. Doctors had been the largest professional group to join the SS. Their crimes had been so great that a separate trial took place in Germany.
The true object of these experiments was not how to rescue or cure, but how to destroy and kill.
Taking to the witness stand at Nuremberg were several young Polish women who had been the subject of terrible experiments.
This scar is 16 inches long.
Wanda Poltowska was a girl guide who had been caught working for the Polish resistance. She was sent to the women's concentration camp at Ravensbrück. One day, Poltowska was ordered to appear in front of SS doctors.
When 6 of us were summoned in August 42, I was sure that I was being summoned for execution. They gave me a clean shirt and a clean bed, and that was a shock. It was one of the few moments when I was very frightened. I didn't know what they might do.
Because German soldiers were suffering terrible wounds at the front, SS doctors decided to test the effectiveness of drugs by inflicting similar wounds on concentration camp prisoners.
The group I was in, the tests involved injecting bacteria into the bone marrow cavity and then watching the body react to the infection with a very high temperature. Maybe they wanted to see how high a dose of bacteria the body could bear. In my group there were fatalities. Some died.
The operations were performed by SS doctors. They repeated them several times, removing healthy bone and muscle and inserting shrapnel, dirt and bacteria into the open wounds. They were trying to duplicate battlefield conditions.
My operation was on an operating table with clean sheets, but the others were operated on as they stood with dirty legs on a dirty table, so this was a complete violation of medical principles, even the most inhuman.
5 women died at Ravensbrück from the wound experiments. The others suffered for the rest of their lives. But 4 of the survivors had the satisfaction of identifying their tormentors at the physician's trial. The main culprits were sentenced to death or life imprisonment.
Military Tribunal 1 sentences you, Fritz Fischer, to imprisonment for the full term and period of your natural life.
At Nuremberg, the defense lawyer argued that the wound experiments were part of the war effort. But this defense could not be mounted for experiments conducted by other doctors. Hitler's right-hand man, Heinrich Himmler, had given the order that SS doctors were the only people qualified to perform the selections at Auschwitz. Hans Munch is one of the few Auschwitz doctors who was found not guilty of war crimes, but he remembers Himmler's order.
Himmler was a perfectionist, you know, and it could happen that when the selection was being performed, a layman wouldn't recognize certain features, and you'd end up gassing a few people too many, or too few. So qualified people were supposed to do it. It was their daily job, like other doctors in normal situation would look at